Now, welcome from Brisbane, Reverend Rhonda. Welcome along to Unity of Melbourne, Rhonda.
Thank you, Bill. And good morning, everybody. I was just thinking while that carol was playing, it's actually 16 and a half years since I left Melbourne. Time gets away, doesn't it? And being the first day of Advent, it seemed a good time to start thinking about the Christmas stories. If you think about it, Christmas means different things to different people. You know, for some, a deeply religious time. Others, it's mainly a family gathering with gift giving. For some, a time to withdraw from the day and the season altogether. And for some of it, it's not so much about the stories around Jesus' birth as a reminder to celebrate the Christ presence within ourselves and within everybody. Now, before I get talking about the paradox of Christmas, I want to just take a moment to wish you all a wonderful, blessed, and enjoyable Christmas, however you choose to celebrate Christmas. And nothing that I say today is intended to change anything that you normally do to celebrate Christmas. It's more just to look at the paradox of the stories and how, for a lot of people, they actually are an obstacle to accepting the story of Jesus. So the paradox is about how the stories bring some people closer to God, or as we say in Unity, the Christ presence within, while for others, the stories are part of an unbelievable myth that doesn't sit well in the scientific world of today. So in too many cases, the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. The very elements that put people off are the stories that were written long after Jesus' birth and with no historic authenticity. I invite you to join me in looking at some of these today. Without them, we can focus on the teachings and the modeling of the master teacher Jesus, healer and way shower. Accepting his teachings of the kingdom within each one of us can transform our lives today as they transformed lives back then in Israel. A very wise youngster here amongst our children was talking about Christmas Day not being the actual birthday of Jesus. And she pointed out how good it is to have a birthday celebration for him anyway, to celebrate his life. She added, and it's good that we celebrate his birthday at the end of the year. I agree, it's good to celebrate Jesus' birth and his life and teachings at the end of the year, followed by a new year that can be a celebration of new life, an opportunity to come into new awareness of the Christ within ourselves. This young lass also said it's good that we give presents at Christmas to show people we love them. That makes Father Christmas very appropriate, to be giving anonymous gifts and bringing joy to the world, in a world where joy is too often lacking. Modern Bible scholars have explored the writing of both books of scriptures, looking at when they were written, what was happening in that particular area in that particular time, and how the various writings were addressing the current situations. Only when we understand what they meant to lives then can we see their relevance to the situations we find ourselves in today, both individually and on a global scale. Of course, in Unity, metaphysical interpretation helps us to find meaning in even the most unlikely story. I love the metaphysical interpretation of the star that symbolizes our inner guidance. So regardless of stars moving out of their normal planetary projection, we can know that the star in us is our own guiding star. And the same goes for all the other Christmas stories. I highly recommend the textbook we use in our SEE Bible classes, Reading the Bible Again for the First Time. The author, Bible scholar, the late Marcus Borg, that's B-O-R-G, Borg, has been described as a leading figure in his generation of Jesus scholars. We read about him and this book. Borg explores what the scriptures meant to the ancient communities that produced and lived by them. He then helps us to discover the meaning of these stories, providing the knowledge and perspective to make the wisdom of the Bible an essential part of our modern lives. The author argues that the conventional way of seeing the Bible's origin, authority, and interpretation has become unpersuasive to millions of people in our time, and that we need a fresh way of encountering the Bible that takes the text seriously, but not literally, even as it takes seriously who we have become. And I thought about that word, unpersuasive, and I thought, you know, that's exactly right. A lot of the stories that we present at Christmas as being true stories that happened in history are very unpersuasive in this day and age. In another book about the Bible, The Evolution of the Word, Borg gives us a very enlightening timeline for the writing of the Gospels and letters which became the Christian scriptures, that is, what we used to call the New Testament. We may have presumed from Sunday school days that the oldest account of Jesus' life was the Gospel of Matthew, because that's first in the Bible, right? And that the letters of Paul were written later than the Gospels, because that's where we find them in the Bible. But at least the letters that Paul actually wrote himself when he was alive, because there's later ones that he wrote after his death by some miracle, they are placed in a very different timeline and situation than these early ones. They're in the order of size in the Bible, nothing to do with when they were written. So let's just have a look at the Christmas stories in the various Gospels. And the very earliest Gospel written was the Gospel of Mark, written in the 70s. So we're talking 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion. And it's about the time when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple and dispersed the Jews. They had to run for their lives virtually and became what we call the diaspora. The Jews spread right around the Mediterranean. So whoever Mark was, and we really don't know, decided that instead of waiting around for Jesus to come back, which is what they'd been doing all those years, it would be good to record what he could of Jesus' life and teachings. Just as a little side note, the Gospel of Mark begins with the words, "In the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ," and added much later were the words, "the Son of God." Anyway, the Gospel of Mark starts with John the Baptist, so no birth story, no pregnant virgin. These were added in two of the later Gospels. And the word translated as virgin simply means a young woman, a young engaged woman in this case. And by the way, the Gospel of Mark originally finished with the women at the tomb being greeted by a young man dressed in white. And they fled in fear from the tomb. no angels, no appearances, no being taken up to sit on the right hand of God, which reminds me of the story of the grandmother and grandchild who, out driving one day, came across a truly beautiful scene. And the grandmother said to the child, "Look at that beautiful scenery that God has painted." And the child said, "Yes, and painted with his left hand too." The grandma said, "What do you mean?" And the child said, "Well, Jesus sits on his right hand." So this is the sort of material that has become unpersuasive to millions of people in our time. Mind you, Mark gives us some lovely parables, like the one about Jesus stilling the water during the storm, and the famous words that have stuck through all these years: peace, be still. We all have the power to say to our stormy moods and our negative thoughts, peace, be still. They're good words to use in a fear situation. And I had a chance to actually try them out some years ago when I was on a lake in a rowboat with a friend. And a storm came up and the water became quite frightening with big waves where it had been very calm when we'd set off earlier. And I recognized that I was starting to feel afraid. And of course, we all know that fear attracts more negative situations. And so I decided, okay, Lord, let's see if these words that Jesus spoke are effective. So I actually said to the waves, peace, be still. I said it several times. Peace, be still. And I'm ashamed to say, to my absolute amazement, the water calmed. And we got very safely back to where we'd hired the boat. It was a huge lesson for me not to underestimate the words of Jesus. But even Mark was not the first account of Jesus' life. The 7 letters written by St. Paul while he was alive date back to the 50s. And as I said, the negative ones, which I call the letters Paul wrote after his death, were written in a later era, so certainly not written by Paul. Let's move on to the Gospel of Matthew, which was written in the 80s. This gospel retells the Mark story to show Jesus as a prophet, as the Messiah. The gospel titled Matthew was written in the 80s, so 50 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. It included most of the Gospel of Mark, plus many quotes from the Hebrew Scriptures and quotes from another unknown document, which has been called the Quell document. It's also used in the Gospel of Luke. None of the Gospels were written by disciples who were with Jesus. But personally, I like to think that the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew could have been written, maybe some notes taken by Matthew at the time, who was, after all, a scribe, so he could read and write. And such notes could easily have been passed on through 2 or 3 generations and incorporated in the gospel that we call by the name of Matthew today. Maybe that's an unlikely story and it's just my own theory. I've never found it in any of the Bible scholars, theologians. But it makes sense to me because chapters 6 and 7 of Matthew are so detailed and so much truth packed into 2 chapters, and just for me feel so authentic to the teachings of Jesus. In those pages, you'll find gems such as love your enemies, do not worry about your life, strive first for the kingdom, and all these things will be added. And ask, and it will be given. Seek, and you will find. some wonderful recipes for a happy and successful life in those 2 chapters. So that's Matthew 6 and 7. Whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew was writing to the Jews to convince them that Jesus was the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. So he used midrash, that's writing later events back into an earlier time, to present Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah of the Hebrew Gospels. And according to a Bible scholar by the name of Busby, the first 2 chapters of Matthew are not found in early versions of the book. They are later additions in the 4th century. The original version, like Mark, started with John the Baptist at what is now chapter 3. That eliminates the story of Herod killing the Hebrew babies, which is totally unauthenticated by Roman records, and the Romans were very good at keeping records, and the trip into Egypt. Perhaps the compiler of Matthew wanted Jesus to come out of Egypt like Moses did. So about a decade later, we have the Gospel of John, also with no birth story, also starts with John the Baptist. And the Gospel of John is very different to the other 3. I always think of it as the metaphysical gospel. There's a lot of unity in it. Or maybe I should say there's a lot of the Gospel of John in unity. I like the story about the stranger who came to the gates of a city, and he said to the gatekeeper, "I hear that a lot of famous men were born here." And the gatekeeper said, "No, we've never had any famous men born here." And he said, "Oh, but I've heard about, various ones, and this city is always mentioned." And he said, "Well, it's true that a lot of our babies have grown up to be famous men, but we've never had any famous men born here." So the latest gospel is the Gospel of Luke, written somewhere around 110 to 120 years into the Christian era. So we're looking at 80 or 90 years after Jesus' crucifixion, 40 or 50 years after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans and the dispersal of the Jews. Luke's version is to convince the Greco-Roman world that Jesus was a god like their gods. His story of Jesus' conception and birth echoed the Greco-Roman gods, and there's no mention of fleeing to Egypt. It's the only gospel that tells of the journey to Bethlehem from Nazareth for Joseph to register, which is again not substantiated by Roman records. There was no such registration. But it's not the stories of Jesus' birth that matter. It's the fact that he was such a great inspirational teacher that his teachings went out into the world and have survived in various forms for over 2,000 years. We can love the stories about Jesus as a baby, but let's not make them an essential part of being a Christian. It's unfortunate that the stories added later are the very stories that make a barrier for many people and close so many doors to spiritual learning. The importance for us is that we can take the teachings of the kingdom within and follow Jesus into a spiritual rebirth that inspires us today. The word Christ is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, of the chosen one, the anointed one. So the term Christian simply meant followers of the Messiah. But Jesus taught that we're all chosen ones. needing to turn within to that kingdom that he states very clearly is within us. We can all be more than followers of the Christ. We can be expressions of the Christ presence within us. I love that concept. Not just followers of the Christ, but expressions of the Christ presence within us. Myrtle Fillmore wrote, "One must understand and appreciate life with a goal of radiant health and freedom that come from living from within, in harmony with the inner intelligence and the Christ pattern." It's interesting that today we are witnessing again unhappy times in the Middle East. After the recent religious fighting in Melbourne, Premier Jacinta Allen said there was no place for anti-Semitism or Islamophobia in Victoria, I would say, or in Australia, or in the world. A non-unity friend asked me recently, does Silent Unity pray for the Jews or for the Palestinians? And I replied, we pray for all people who are suffering. So we pray for both, for all. After the horrors of the Nazi atrocities, I can only have sympathy for the surviving Jews wanting to return to their old home country after World War II. But I pray also for the Palestinians who have suffered so much since British occupation and earlier. There have been periods when Palestinians, Jews, and Christians have lived in shared communities in peace. And for that to happen again so that they can share the same country in peace may take a miracle, but we know miracles happen. So let's pray it into reality. Let's also join Premier Allen in not accepting the fighting about it in our own country. Christmas is a time to celebrate the Christ in Jesus. It is a time to celebrate the Christ spirit in ourselves. More than this, let's be aware of the rebirth in our own awareness of the Christ spirit in everyone, regardless of religious background or any other aspect of people in general. And let's remember that Jesus demonstrated so powerfully our ability to love ourselves and to love all people. And Christmas, regardless of what else it might be, is a time for love. Let's take those powerful words of Jesus, peace be still, into a short time of meditation. So I invite you to make yourselves physically comfortable, to breathe out any concerns of the outer world. And to say to every cell of your body, peace, be still. And to say to every thought of your mind, peace, be still. To just breathe in the power of these words and feel that peace throughout your whole being. Peace, be still. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. We take time to sit in the silence, holding to the power of those words. Peace. Be still. And as we know this truth for ourselves, let's know it for our loved ones, for all whose names are on our prayer list. Let's send that idea of peace and love out into the atmosphere to touch the hearts and minds of people everywhere who are suffering. To know for the Jews and the Palestinians and everybody else involved in unhappy situations. Peace. Be still. Peace. Be still. And I invite you to sit on in the silence and let the words of this beautiful song, be still and know, wash over you. Be still and know.